One aspect of the moral and political theory that Thomas Hobbes is articulating in Leviathan that a lot of readers, especially first-time readers, tend to find rather puzzling or even confusing has to do with what we can call moral conceptions. And when we're thinking about moral conceptions, we're thinking about what people often call moral values in the broad generic sense, where we're talking about good and bad, or right and wrong, or even things like beautiful and ugly, or honorable and dishonorable. The useful and the harmful, the pleasurable and the painful were often, in traditional moral theory, brought under those as well, because they can all be understood in terms of various types of goodness or rightness or something along those lines. And you notice that we can't ever escape that entirely, because even if you were to ask, is it good that we talk about these things, or is it good to be very tolerant, you're talking about something that has a moral resonance to it already. Now, when I say that this is often confusing to readers of Hobbes, what I have in mind is this. There's a very important break that's going to take place that we're going to talk about in one of the later videos that has to do with what we call the social contract. Hobbes is going to depict the natural state of humankind as a state in which we're very prone to conflict with each other, because we not only compete with each other, but we value things in ways that are different from each other. And he thinks that societies can break down, even if they are functioning societies, they can break down and devolve into this sort of chaos, this sort of anarchy in terms of moral values. He also writes at many points as if there aren't really moral values in a full sense until you have a functioning civil society that's being regulated according to the norms that are built into the social contract. These are moral norms. They're not merely ways to get along. They're ways to get along because that's what's seen as being good for us. But then once we have them in place, they come to take on the status of what we ought to do, what is good for us. And there's a basic level of agreement, even if it has to be a forced agreement, in society, in Hobbesian society, that the social contract is providing us. So do we have any sort of moral norms or moral values outside of the social contract? Well, the answer is yes. And one reason, this is again why it's often confusing. I'm going to give you a clue here. This is something I've done quite a bit of work on myself. One reason why the state of nature is such a mess, according to Hobbes, is that it's not that there's no morality whatsoever in the state of nature. There's too many competing moralities, and even in the same person, we're going to see that they can't remain consistent and constant over time. So this is a really important way to sort of like transform how we're looking at it. And the key to this is going to be in these chapters that I'm having you read, chapter 9 on the difference of manners, and chapter 6 on the involuntary beginnings of voluntary motions, because there's a couple really important clues that we're going to find in there. So I've tallied those up here, and I put them under the category of human being because Hobbes thinks that this applies to every one of us. Remember, Hobbes has this mechanistic conception. Our minds are really just extensions of our bodies, what's going on in our brain, if you like. He thought the heart had something to do with it, but we know that now it's really about the brain. But the body's in continual motion. If you have this materialistic conception of things, the brain itself is in continual motion. That doesn't mean that it's like, moving from place to place, but what he means by motion is any sort of important change. If you think about what your brain actually is, it's this very complex set of circuits that are, they're made out of cells. They're made out of neurons. And those neurons are constantly firing electrical impulses back and forth. You add to this other systems like our circulatory system and our hormonal system and what's going on in our, all the bacteria in our body and the effects that they're producing. And you have this body that's in continual flux, not only in terms of its organs that are, the heart's pumping away, but the brain as well. So because our body is in continual motion, that's going to have some important effects when it comes to what it is that we desire and what it is that we're averse to. We'll get to that in a moment. He says that desires and aversions themselves are changing over time, and we'll come back to that. I want to talk about this thing that he brings up about there being no final end. He ends up saying this in the section. Here we go. This is in chapter 9 of the difference of manners. He says, when we're thinking about the felicity of this life, felicity means happiness. Happiness is what we're supposed to all be striving after. And in traditional moral theory, it was often thought, well, you know, we may disagree about what happiness looks like, but in general, there is some final end that we're aiming at. Plato thought that there was something like this. Aristotle thought there was something like this. Boethius did. You know, many other thinkers. So Hobbes says there is no such finis ultimus, final end, the ultimate end, the goal that we're all seeking, nor summum bonum, greatest good, the good that would encompass all the other goods or would, you know, outweigh it, the one that we ought to sacrifice everything else to get. Why? He says, well, because nothing can retain that sort of status for us over time. Why? Because we do change in our desires and aversions, because our body is changing over time. So not only can you not get two individual people to get on the same page as far as what, you know, the final end or the highest good would be, you can't even get the same one person over the course of time to do that. And he's got this wonderful passage where he says that human beings, you know, what's really driving us, he says, in the first place I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Why? Well, when he talks about power, what he means there is that which can get us what we want or stave off what we don't want. When we're talking about desire and aversion, power is what gets us what we desire. And there's a lot of different kinds of power, you know. Being able to read, that's a power. This capacity to produce YouTube videos, so another power. The lights that are shining down, quite literally power, right? And so power allows us to get what we want and to not get or to escape what we want against, what we are averse to. So he says the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he's already attained to, or that he cannot be content with moderate power, but that he cannot assure the power and means to live well. What you just saw there is a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about here in Hobbes. You know, we have some unreliable lighting here shining down on me, and it went out. And the same thing can happen in our bodies. It almost, you know, fit the bill, you might say. So he says, you know, the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he's already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well which he has present without acquisition of more. We're constantly striving for more and more and more. We want to be secure. We want to ward off the things that we're averse to. So we can never really be content, according to Hobbes. You know, he says some other interesting things about this as well. He says, a man's desire is not to enjoy once and only for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. But we're not really capable of doing that because our future desires are in fact off in the future. They are changing, as we're going to see. So he goes on and he says, a man cannot live whose desires are at an end. Why? Because what it is to be alive, what it is to exist as a living being, as the kind of beings that we are, is to be desiring and to be averse. But because our bodies are changing, we're going into new circumstances, we desire different things. Our desires and aversions alter in their objects. We've seen too that all these passions come out of the desires and aversions. That means that we change our minds and we change our feelings about things. Now Hobbes is going to draw out some very important corollaries to this as well. And I skipped over some of the sections where he was talking about these different moral values or distinctions, these terms, in the previous video, because I wanted to put them here so that we could think about the implications of the fact that our bodies are changing and therefore our desires and aversions are changing, because that means these things are going to be changing as well, which is a big issue, a big problem, you might say, for any sort of common social life. So what does all this stuff over here mean? Well, you notice that I've got the three basic affects of desire or love, aversion or hatred, and contempt. And desire or love leads us to seeing something as good. What it is that we desire, we see that as good. It's not that it was good prior necessarily to our desiring it. Some things we can cause to be good for us just because of our desires. For example, this piece of chalk, very useful for me right now, isn't it? Because I can explain things to you. It's even a good thing for you, insofar as you like seeing things on the chalkboard. But does this have any intrinsic goodness in it? No, it's only good because it's a useful thing. We wouldn't even say that it's delightful or beautiful or anything like that. So when we desire something, when we love something, when we see something under the aspect of the good, we call it good. And if we change our minds about what we desire, we're going to change our minds about what is good. So consider an example. Is it good for you to be in college right now? I would assume most of you would say yes. Those who change their mind about it quit going to college. Or they go to college and they're continually griping about how they can't wait to be finished and when they're going to get on with their life and go back to the real world and all that sort of stuff that people tend to say when they're discontent. Discontentment like that comes about because our desires change. Consider relationships. You're attracted to somebody, that person is attracted to you, you go out on a few dates, now you get, involved with them and people say, oh, they're a couple, they're dating. And then one of you one day says, I don't find you attractive anymore. And then the other person says, well, that's not fair, I still find you attractive. And, this is the stuff that movies are made of, isn't it? And sappy songs. But what that means is what was good in the eyes of somebody at one time has changed. Likewise, what we see as evil or bad can change over time. When you're a kid, here's a great example. Just think about tastes. When you're a kid, candy tastes really good. It continues to taste pretty good as an adult. But as you age, particularly if you're a male, your tongue actually changes. The receptors in your tongue, some of them become stronger and some of them become weaker. Think about beer. I remember as a kid, taking a sip of my dad's beer because he'd always send me to go get him a beer because he worked very hard and would sit out on the deck. And I would get it and I took a sip of it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is awful. How can anybody possibly drink this? I viewed it as something bad. Not evil in a moral sense, but something bad. Something foul, something unpleasant. Now I like beer. Why do I like beer? Particularly bitter beers like IPAs? Because my taste receptors have changed. That's a matter of my body having changed, and therefore also my aversions and desires having changed. There's all sorts of things like that. We can talk about, fashion. Why do we wear ties? This is one of the silliest things, but it's part of, you might say, uniform of the bourgeois or the academic or the professional. But, when you think about it, it's extremely silly. How can you get people to pay, $50 or $100 for something like this? Well, you appeal to their desires. And if you change desires into aversions, you change things that are good into things that are evil or things that are bad. There's also the in-between, that which we feel contempt about, that which we don't really care about. Remember, Hobbes says things that we don't feel aversion or desire towards, it's oftentimes because we're feeling aversion and desire to other things, we call contemptible. We see them as, he says, vile or inconsiderable. Vile doesn't mean evil in this sense. Vile just meant, it's nothing that I really care about. It's, our modern day term for that would be, meh, I don't care. But if we go on, we see that Hobbes is developing a whole moral vocabulary out of this as well. And this is worth dwelling on. So he talks about things being good in three senses and evil or bad in three senses. He also does a little bit of etymology there, which probably doesn't make that much sense to you, but is, nice to think about at least a little bit. He says that whatsoever is the object of man's appetite or desire, he calls good, hate or evil, hate and aversion evil, contempt vile and considerable. These are used in relation to the person who uses them. There's nothing in simply absolutely so. And then we can start to use these other things. He says, the Latin tongue, meaning, Latin, has two words whose significations approach to those of good and evil, but are not precisely the same, pulchrum and turpe. And in Greek, these would be kalon and ischron. Those languages have a broader range of signification when it comes to that than we do. So, think about how we could translate kalon or pulchrum from Greek or Latin. Hobbes gives us a whole bunch of words that we use. Fair, not fair in the sense of, being fair to somebody, but fair in the sense of attractive, fair in the sense of good to look upon. Beautiful, handsome, honorable, comely, amiable. For turpa, he's got a great set of list of words here. Foul, deformed, ugly, base, nauseous, and the like. So, he says, in the promise, goodness in the promise, when we see something and we see it as beautiful, when we see it as attractive, when we see it as, I'd like to get some of that, we're seeing goodness in the promise. So think about, an attractive person. The promise there is something like, boy, if I was going out with them, I'd be going out with a really good-looking person, and I would enjoy that. We could talk about that in terms of food, though, as well. Have you ever looked at an advertisement and, you're kind of hungry, and by the end of the advertisement, you're really hungry, and you're thinking, man, I should go out and get something to eat. You are being actuated by those images that are helping you to see, because of your desire, that thing as good in the promise. It's going to be so wonderful to sink my teeth into that burger or lasagna or whatever. In any case, good in the promise is what we call, fair or beautiful. Evil in the promise is what we call foul or deformed or ugly or nauseous. So that's one modality of the good. Another modality is in the effect. When we see something as good, we love it, we desire it, and then we actually have it, we get it, we feel a sense of delight or pleasure. There's nothing very tricky about this. You could multiply all sorts of examples. On the other hand, when we don't like something, when we're averse to it, and we see it as bad, and then we actually have to endure it, we see that as unpleasant. So, poking yourself in the face with poke yourself in the eye with a piece of chalk, that's going to be unpleasant. You should be averse to that. We can think of all sorts of other things as well. So that's another important modality, the effect. And then he's got this discussion of means. There are many things that we see as good or as bad, not because we see them as good or bad in themselves, not because they provide us with pleasure or pain in themselves, or because they promise us that sort of thing, but because they're a means to an end that we either desire or we are averse to. So, for example, medicine. Nowadays medicines all taste pretty good, but back in the day, they used to taste pretty bad before they figured out that you could add all sorts of flavors to them. And we could talk about bitter medicine. it's not a lot of fun taking medicine. Actually, we could use another example too. Antibiotics, they may taste good, but they produce bad effects in our digestive system, but they kill the bacteria, right? They're good, they're useful, they are helpful to us in attaining what it is that we want when we're sick, not to be sick. There's all sorts of things that we desire as means, but we don't really want as ends. One great example, that would be money, right? Money by itself has no intrinsic value. It's only because we can exchange it for the things that we really want. The opposite of that, of course, would be the harmful, that which is damaging to us, that which maybe leads to something that's unpleasant or something that's foul, or which takes away something good. Now, why did I go through all of that? What I wanted to stress to you, all of these distinctions, all of these senses, good, evil, fair, delightful, useful, foul, unpleasant, harmful, they're all coming because of the play of desire and aversion. Now, desire and aversion, for us human beings, don't remain the same. Why? Because a human being is material. And we are, like Hobbes says, in our bodies in continual motion, in continual change, in continual flux. That means that our desires don't remain the same over time. Even if we try to make them remain the same over time, that means that what we call good and evil, what we call beautiful and ugly, what we even call useful and harmful, is not going to be something that we can rely upon and determine once and for all. It's going to be something that depends on the person. Not only is beauty in the eye of the beholder for Hobbes, as is ugliness, but so is the useful, so is the harmful, so is the good as such, and so is the bad as such. It will vary according to person to person to person. So why is this something that's going to lead us into conflict? If you see things in a radically different way than I do, and we both want to get something done, I may see it as a good thing, and you may see it as a bad thing. You and I may disagree about what's beautiful and what's ugly. We may even disagree if we're trying to talk about, whether we should build a ditch or, repave a road or raise taxes or lower taxes, about what are useful and what are harmful means. So there's a lot of potential because of this changeability of human nature. There's a lot of potential for us to run into conflict with each other, and even not to remain consistent with ourselves. You might say, my past self can enter into conflict with my future self, who is going to see things in a very different way. So what is going to give us some sort of solid set of moral conceptions? Ultimately for Hobbes, it's going to be this thing that we're going to call the social contract, and that's where we should leave off, because there's a whole nother video about that.